Well then, Marc Ecko, I am so thrilled to get a chance to bother you. But this is, not too long before Unlabel is coming out, wherein which
That's
we
right.
learn to sell without selling out.
That's
And
right.
it dawned on me that's pretty much the story from the start. I mean, you were some guy who decided way back in the day, I think I'll make some T-shirts, I'll airbrush some kids' fingernails or something, and life goes on. But you parlayed that into well over $1 billion brand, and on the strength of branding. Now, there's a lot of people out there that say branding's a big pile of poop. Your book says not so much. So, what are they missing? Especially sort of on the level of branding oneself. What are they missing?
Well, I think the notion of branding is one of these, well-intended, kind of marketing speak topics that are, carefully packaged in nice, short form, little pithy articles that we get and, on blogs and stuff like that, and in a lot of management speak books. But it's a concept that's misunderstood, like the notion like love is misunderstood. It's often misperceived as the work of the Madison Avenue ad man. It's the work of it's the dirty work of the kind of ad man character, and we look at creation as something that the artist does, that it's something divine to create. We kind of could visualize the famous picture of creation, Michelangelo's creation with, God touching, man's hand. And we don't fancy ourselves creators because we're kind of taught that, you're done creating, once you retire your crayons in kindergarten, first grade, and that's really the work for the artist. And the artist and the ad man, the Don Draper and the Michelangelos, they can't combine. And really what the book tries to posit, and not in a kind of rigid, here's step 1 through 5 kind of a manner, but more in a philosophical manner, is to challenge people, push them a little bit on their heels to, ask themselves, why do they not fancy themselves a creator? What in their lives, in the system, beat the artist out of them? And just because you can't use the plastic arts or paint or play an instrument doesn't mean that you can't think or problem solve like an artist. And great brands use the problem solving of artists. And if you like it or not, in this day and age where you're going to be packaged, if it's in your social media profile, in the one of 10 jobs that you're likely to have in your career, for better or worse, on your LinkedIn profile, there are best practices that we as brands use that people should use. And what are those best practices? How do you draw on those skill sets, but at the same time, not get caught in the trappings of a brand? Because from my personal experiences, and I use my experiences through the book, there's good and bad. That knife cuts both ways. And if you're not careful, you could be seduced by the sexy part of the brand that we perceive, the skin to the world. That's what I talk about in the book. The brand that you perceive, from here to you, versus the one that's inside you got to reconcile and kind of put to bed at night and make peace with, and keep healthy.
Hey, Marc, one part of that, I think, especially given your upbringing in sort of the land of graffiti art, is when you make a mistake, you just paint over, or you do something different, or you paint yourself back out of the corner. I think one of the fears that people get into with brands is they think that the thing that they believe is the core of their brand is I think there's a big distance between the core of one's brand and how one's expressing it. How do you convince people that they've got to be like that artist, where they have to consider nothing sacred and they do have to sort of rip down, all the way to the core elements sometimes, or don't you? I mean, I guess how does that sort of fear factor of creating brands play into this with the work that you're doing inside of Unlabel?
Well, in the book Unlabel, and what I try to express throughout the book as a tenant to help people distinguish what I talk about when I talk about the brand that's perceived versus the guts to the skin brand. There's the two profiles. The one that's like on the inside, right? That's a little bit maybe self-helpy sounding, or trying to shrink your head. But there is that brand that's the guts to the skin, and that's the most authentic brand that kind of that ultimately is for better or worse, is what you have to satisfy in order to be truly contented, right? And truly wealthy and truly create wealth that matters, versus the brand that's perceived. And there's best practices in exploiting the brand that's perceived, the excitement, the fanfare, the aspirational parts. But how do you not get deceived in the perception, or how do you not kind of drink your own Kool-Aid so much that you decay your authentic values? And I think today, more than ever, it's more crucial than ever to be able to reconcile, a strategy that ultimately satisfies that guts to the skin brand. And, it's not one of these things that culturally we teach people. It's not like and I don't want to sound all like, like a Tea Party fanatic or some like overly conservative guy, because I'm really not. But our cultural atmosphere is such where we tell people to kind of celebrate X, Y, and Z things that are kind of the veneer. And there are repercussions to that. And now more than ever, that brand travels with you, right? And you have to really be certain that that's authentic to your values. If that's who you really are, good on you. But, you really have to reconcile that, from here till, the grave. And you're allowed to evolve and iterate. And you're right. You as a creator have to be fearless. You have to be fearless to give it a shot, and iterative. Like, artists are allowed to make mistakes. In business and in entrepreneurship, we kind of, and in all the systems that we are kind of measured to comply to, K through 12, college, right? We're taught that there's all these benchmarks of compliance that we're measured by. And you can exhibit to me your understanding of something by your ability to pass that compliance standard. Oh, you got an A in Business 101, or you got an A in pharmacology. So you must be very good at that. You must be good at business. You must be a good pharmacist, right? Where that's not really how life is, right? So you have to be willing to paint outside the lines, screw up, iterate, make massive mistakes, and play with the clay, play with the paint, and allow yourself to get dirty, as long as you're operating from a very core, authentic place that's true to your core values. You can't really do wrong if you're operating from that place. You're allowed to, yes, one might perceive you as naive, or one might perceive you as rough around the edges. But if you're operating from a place that's...
Gotcha. We lost you there for just a second. I don't know. Maybe we had a disturbance in the force. It's all good.
What I was saying is that you can't have begrudge yourself or allow others to begrudge you for having tried to create from a very authentic place. You are allowed to try, despite what people say. Put it down, don't touch. Despite waiting for external forces to measure them. Oh, you got a 98, or you have X thousands of followers, or you're this popular, that all these standards that we're taught to measure ourselves by. Real creators will act on an urge, an emotional urge to create something, knowing that they might fuck up, and that's okay.
I was just thinking through the concept of, one of the concepts that you put up in the book Unlabel is, craft explosive marketing and publicity that'll be remembered. And it's funny that my first recollection of you, the person, besides you, the brand, like I knew the brand before I knew the person at all, was watching the Air Force One project. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty big and explosive marketing and big publicity. We're kind of pushed to avoid that kind of stuff. And for God's sake, don't go big. If you were talking to the absolute, I don't know, you pop up in Penn Station, there's, yet another guy with his $20 CD, which probably isn't even his music there. And he's trying to get known and seen and rise above. I mean, what's your chunk of Yoda advice for that guy?
Well, I mean, it's all about distribution, I guess. And I would challenge that in that venue, it's going to be hard to satisfy expectations of some kind of great breakout event happening from that kind of a venue, because you're in a very kind of overly broad distribution channel in that place. That said, it's a good place to create evidence and kind of test market yourself. But in this day and age, when there's so much static and noise out there, which makes it increasingly harder to break out, there's also great opportunity if you allow yourself to think a little bit more strategically and in a manner where you might fall down to try to market in a more specific and targeted way to who their core demo is. Those types of artists typically are kind of like lost souls, and when you challenge them on, well, who's your market, who's your demographic, it's those kind of questions are almost looked at as dirty words. Like, why do they have to be commercially responsible to have to even answer those kind of questions? I just want to create and just satisfy. Well, that's kind of a tragic way of creating something. I talk about that in my book, where you kind of suffer for your art, you starve for all the wrong reasons, you starve explicitly for your art. This is something that's it's a very American phenomenon, very much came from the last century. In order to truly be an artist, you need to be on the balls of your ass, at the bleeding edge, starving, and I think that's a fallacy. I think you're ultimately a more commercially viable artist and more creatively viable artist if you have a better understanding of your market, to know that being in the middle of Times Square or in the Port Authority is an overly broad distribution channel. Like, how am I? That's like trying to break the next great flavored meat topping in a Walmart superstore where it's overly broad. And there's an overly broad assortment of different products, and you don't know where the condom aisle is, yet alone the flavor, the food flavoring or seasoning, or the garbage bags are. It's an overly broad platform. But I think creating evidence or getting a sense of your viability, or kind of shedding away the skin that is your fear, ultimately, that's guarding your action. And if that's what it takes, great. But if that's where you think you're going to find your next great break, I think you're deceived.
So is that, to me, I guess the question would be, I think that's one of the other big myths too, is, for instance, a guy like Eminem coming out with Berserk, if you don't think for a minute that this isn't him trying to, get a better commercial viable success after, how he did with his last two albums, Relapse and Recovery, it seems like a lot of times people mistake being a full-on artist with not in any way caring or wanting to have any connection to the commercial aspect. It seems to me that's what Unlabel is trying to do really hard, is say, you've got to be both. You can't just be one, or you're going to fall underneath the water. Is that true?
Yes, that's 100% true. I think this is really a business book for the creative class, and for those that might fancy themselves an artist or creator. And creators are sensitive people. Like we're emotionally sensitive. We're vulnerable, and often it's those very things that make us great at problem solving or at eventing that also inhibit us and make us shut-ins or bitter because we had that big idea that we just never got to, or someone beat us to the punch. You have to be relentless and unapologetic and selfish. And the book talks about that. I talk explicitly in the formula around unique voice as one of the core kind of components that compose this notion of authenticity. If you could formulate authenticity and the best practices of what an authentic person, event, scenario, instance is, one of the tenets of that in the formula is this notion of unique voice. And I say unique voice is your, action minus your fear divided by yourself, and self being your capacity to be selfish or not. Often we are taught, it's the K through 12 pedagogy, it's the world we live in, it's our society, this kind of, even when we're trying to be black sheep, we're sometimes guilty of being in that herd of black sheep where we're all holding each other's hand, kind of wanting to feel the safety of the crowd. A real unique voice that's authentic will say, I could hear enough of my own voice to break out and create that differentiator from the rest of the market, right? But that selfishness alone isn't enough. If you're not going to act, if you're not going to overcome your fear, then you're just a guy in jail with a great idea. There's plenty of guys I've met in prison or, in the prison of the world, ever real or metaphor, that have great ideas. Talking and acting, two very distinct and separate things. Right? A lot of professional critics and pundits, but that doesn't mean that those are, just because you have that big notion, I dare you, motherfucker, go for it. And that's what it takes to get to really qualify a unique voice. Having that selfishness that defines your unique voice, but then being willing to act on it. Not a degree of selfishness where it's so selfish that it results in your hubris or you become a dictator, like a Hitler or a Jabba the Hutt, but one that there's certainly a distinction. Let's say if we use it as an example, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Steve Jobs was a more selfish, creative thinker. His self, his function of self was notionally higher than, let's say, Bill Gates, who's more open OS, kumbaya, everything for everyone. Where a Jobs is much more specific. If that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. Absolute zigzag of a question. You do all kinds of work with various charities, a lot of them that you've put together and started, and you're also on the board of a bunch of different things like that as well. It's I think it's also a misunderstanding when people think of selfish, that selfish doesn't lend itself to doing things and giving back. Or rather, there's a lot of people I think who say, I've got to do my hustle first and then I'm going to give back. But guys like Richard Branson have said, we need to recreate our new businesses to have a sense of charity early. What's your take on that whole process and how people have to be part of that?
Well, actually I talk about it briefly in the book, and I was definitely found myself very lucky in life, that I was able to be young and be able to, give a disproportionate amount of my income to different causes and the such. That said, upon reflecting on it, I actually encourage a certain thoughtfulness in the investment of how you give philanthropically. And I have to tell you that though I was of the means, let's say at 32 to 37 years old, to give a lot, I probably didn't have the mental restraint or capacity to really be as rigorous about that giving. And I think that with great, like the Peter Parker kind of thing, with great power comes great responsibility. I could tell you, I don't what's the word, resent, or I don't have any grief for those years of having given early on, but I would say that I give smarter today than I did then. And that there is this kind of new money thing that happens that I was definitely guilty of. In my first few years of guilting, for whatever it is that motivates you, whatever the psychology of, I can't speak for others. I could tell you for me, there was this awkward sense in my own skin, and often in me being comfortable in the kind of the this new brand that I had become, both, the one that was being perceived and how it was affecting me personally, that I don't know if it was like a guilt trip or this sense of, well, if I don't do it now, it'll never happen. But I certainly reflect on those early years of giving. And what I would advise is when you get that sense, take a third of your capacity and give it away for that kind of immediate gratification, and take the other 2/3 and put it away in escrow, with a lawyer, knowing that you will give it away, but you need more time to be more thoughtful about it, because it is a great responsibility to give. And I think we, in a society where we have now come up as this generation of young people that, I see it with my own kids that feel very kind of connected to want to give back, which is great. You want to give with the same kind of rigor you would apply to your business or you building yourself, the expectations for yourself, right? So if you're going to have these kind of flip expectations about return on investment, you're underserving those whom you are trying to help, right? Because you can't give in that kind of a sustainable manner unless you're like Bill Gates. And even a Bill Gates has reflected on his ability to give, let's say, to education. I mean, there's an infamous article I think he wrote for either I don't want to, I'll probably get it wrong, but it was like the Wall Street Journal, the Times, or the Washington Post, where he kind of reflected on his $50 million of giving to education and how it was kind of squandered. That was kind of the subtext of his article. I don't have that kind of money, but what I do give is probably proportionate to my wealth. And I could tell you now I'm far more rigorous and more measured, and I would prescribe to anyone who is willing to hold that giving to the same level of rigor and accountability that you would be if you were taking that money and applying it to something for profit. It is that much more gratifying when you do that.
That's a very, very good advice, and it runs a little counter to what you would expect, and yet makes a great deal of sageness. This is all follows into your step of being Yoda and promoting other Yodas out there. The book is Unlabel. The man is Marc Ecko. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, man. It was good to see you.